This is the chapter of the book that deals with the rise of Islam and medieval Islamic society. You would think that that would be the easiest chapter for a person to write if that person happened to be a specialist on medieval Islam, because you'd already know everything. It turned out it was not an easy chapter to write, and now that I look back on it and think about the things I want to say about it, I really have great misgivings about what I wrote in the chapter. In some measure, I felt coerced in small things. For example, publisher saying after the first draft, "You didn't mention the 5 pillars of Islam." I thought, it's because I don't think the 5 pillars of Islam are particularly interesting. And even though they show up in a few hadith of the Prophet, they're really not co-equal. You know, pilgrimage and paying alms and prayer and fasting and the profession of faith in God and His messenger, when they're presented as 5 pillars, you think, well, here is a structure that is supported by these 5 co-equal things. And they're by no means co-equal, neither in their substance nor in their continuity over time, so that the importance of these different things changes over time. And I felt that if I put in a paragraph about the 5 pillars of Islam, which I eventually felt forced to do, that I would be contributing to the notion of a homogenization of Muslim experience over historical time, which I am opposed to. Then there was the question of what readers' expectations were. For me to write about the Tang Dynasty or the Kievan Russia, where I'm not a specialist, I can go take several books, read them, fold them together, add a little bit of fairy dust, and come up with my own truncated narrative of what they say. But ultimately, I'm not responsible for what they say because I don't know what I'm talking about. And it's a great relief. You try and pick the best books to put together, but the problem is that when you are an authority, as I fancy I am in this area, you can't do that, and yet you know how other people in your field handle the history, and you don't want to be such an outlier that it doesn't sound like Islamic history. At one point there was I think it was after the 3rd edition or the 2nd edition, one of the reviewers, a user, I think in a small college in California, wrote and said he thought the entire chapter should be scrapped because the new scholarly view maintained that Muhammad never existed, that the Quran was composed by a gaggle of rabbis in Iraq 200 years after the alleged date of Muhammad's life, and that it arose as a Jewish heresy and had blah, blah, blah. Well, now, that's a completely different view of Islam. And it is one that has some distinguished, if profoundly mistaken scholars who support it. And I could see that someone who is not a specialist might say, oh, well, maybe I should look into it and maybe I should lean in that direction. So I leaned in that direction for about 1 paragraph just to acknowledge that there was this deviant view out there. And I thought, that's fine. You had a basic story of the rise of Islam and spread of the Caliphate. And of course, they had the usual things, put in more about women, put in more about Spain. Everyone thinks Spain is cool. But the basic narrative is sort of a white bread narrative. Now, I've come to think that it's deeply mistaken. And I don't know what to do about it. I don't know whether to write it the way I think it happened, in which case the sixth edition would depart dramatically from both from the first 5 editions and from every other world history textbook, or whether to sort of sneak subversive thoughts in sort of between paragraphs and imply that there might be a different way of telling the story. Now, the nice thing about having a chance to lecture is that I can give you the revised version. And then you can compare it to the written version. The revised version really arises to some extent, as I look at it in afterthought, having finally come up with it, on some problems that were very difficult to answer about what happened in the early, the first 2 or 3 centuries of Islam. What we believe from the chronicles and from the way the chronicles have been digested by modern historians. I say what we believe because all the chronicles are written at least 200, 300, 400 years after these events. So they are, in large part, hearsay. They don't, for the most part, quote documents. They quote oral histories that are, in many cases, fundamentally unbelievable. But what that story says is that the prophet died in 632 or 630. He was followed by a series of 4 caliphs, from 630 to 632 for Abu Bakr, from 632 to 642 for Omar, 642 to 654 for Uthman, and then you have a civil war after the death of Uthman, because Uthman was assassinated, and that is called the First Fitna, this all-purpose word in Arabic that covers disorders in the body social, all the way from a civil war down to a family dispute. It's really quite interesting that you can have a single word that covers disorders at every level of aggregation, not wars. There's a separate word for war. But fitna is a disorder in the body social that does not have a clear analog in English, because in English we tend to define disorders according to the scale. So in other words, a feud would not be mistaken for a civil war, or an argument would not be mistaken for a civil war, or an uppity wife would not be mistaken for a civil war. But all these things can be fitna. So you have the first fitna after the assassination of Uthman in 654. All of this looked at from several centuries posterior to the events in the chronicles that we have. And out of that, there arises two things. First, a movement dedicated to Uthman's immediate successor, Ali, Ibn Abi Talib, Muhammad's cousin and son-in-law, the husband of his wife Fatima. And this is what yields Shiism. The Shia word for party in Arabic literally means the Shiat Ali, the party of Ali. And all Shiites everywhere at all times believe that the leadership of the community, spiritually and in many cases politically, rightfully belongs, by rightful I mean by divine right, to some descendant of Ali. Sunni Islam is by and large defined as those Muslims who are not Shiites, who believe that there should be some other way of finding out who's the leader, and it could be a descendant of Ali. There's nothing to preclude a descendant of Ali being regarded as the political leader by Sunnis. The king of Jordan is a direct descendant of Ali. The king of Morocco is a direct descendant of Ali, and yet neither one is a Shiite, because it is not a divinely sanctioned leadership that is marked by their role as king, but rather a leadership that comes about through some, sort of subhuman, sublunar device. People have figured out a way to decide who's the leader, whereas among the Shiites, it's God. So that's one thing that comes out of it. And then the opponent of Ali founds what is called the First Dynasty in Islam. These are the Umayyads, the people who come from the clan of Umayyah. And until 750, they provide the government in the Islamic community. The first four caliphs, Abu Bakr, Omar, Uthman, and Ali, are later called the rightfully guided caliphs. The Rashidun. They weren't called the Rashidun at the time. It's a term somebody invented and was used. And the Umayyads, who set up their government in opposition to Ali, and Ali gets assassinated in the process, they are called by the later chroniclers the people who introduced mulk into Islam. Mulk meaning kingship, which is a negative term. It's mulk as opposed to the caliphate, khilafah, the quality of being a caliph, even though these Umayyad kings were in fact caliphs. That was the title they used. But later chroniclers, who were hostile to their memory, ascribed this mulk to them. So I'm not going to pursue this story beyond this, because it's a construct that is extremely meaningful for understanding how the world Muslim community looks at its roots. But it doesn't necessarily jibe with with things that may actually have occurred. I'm not saying these things didn't occur. I'm just saying that it's the question of emphasis interpretation that is more questionable. For example, everybody agrees that when the Arabs conquered certain very important provinces of the Byzantine Empire, specifically Syria, Egypt, and Tunisia, everybody agrees that retained the essentials of the Byzantine administration, and they retained the Byzantine currency. That is to say, they continued to mint gold dinars, the Latin word denarius. And these gold dinars, up until very shortly after the year 700, had a picture on it of the caliph. And on the back, they had the genuine Byzantine one had something like this, a cross on some steps. So the Muslims came up with one that had steps, and that instead. They removed the arms of the cross. Then there's a question of what in the world this was. And it shows up actually in a more specific way in a silver coin, where it is shown as like this with a couple of ribbons floating out. And it's interpreted that this was the spear of Muhammad, and that when he led people in prayer to indicate the direction they should pray, he would thrust the foot of his spear into the ground, and that was the initial qibla, the initial indication of the direction of prayer. We don't know whether this is true or not, but it's a good story, and this thing does look sort of like a spear, except for this. And the interpretation of that, given the date of the particular coin this shows, is that this occurred after one of the most zealous advocates of Ali was executed by the Caliph for raising Cain in the name of Ali. And the way this would happen was that, when you would have the prayer on Friday, which is the noon prayer, which is when blessings are called upon the ruler and the ruler is named, under these Umayyads who believed in mulk, they would call blessings on the Caliph who lived in Damascus, and then they would call curses down on Ali and his family. And the cursing of Ali really annoyed the people who had been close to him and to his family. And so in response, they would pick up stones from the floor of the mosque and throw them at the prayer leader. Now, the reason we know something about this, although we may not really know it, but their chronicles report in such and such a year, the mosque was paved. And the interpretation is that they put in paving stones in the mosque, so there weren't any free stones to pick up to throw at the prayer leader. But that meant that you couldn't stick the end of your spear into the ground because you didn't have any soft ground. And so this, by that interpretation, this is a tripod that is meant to sort of hold the spear upright. It's a fanciful story. It may be true. It may be total, historians' baloney. This is what historians do. They make it up part of the time. Maybe a little more than part of the time. Going back to the currency thing, the coins that you had in the Byzantine territories remained the old gold coins that looked very, very similar to the Byzantine coins. And in the Persian areas, Iraq and Iran, the coins were silver and not gold. They were dirhams. They looked and were of the same size as the dirhams of the Sassanid kings, and they had on one side a portrait of the Sassanid ruler. On the other side, they had a Zoroastrian fire altar with two attendants. Now this is the new religion of Islam. It's setting up a state. We're now talking about something like 60 years after the major battles of conquest, and they're still putting out currencies that show images that appear to be those of the Christian Byzantines and the Zoroastrian Sassanids. Plus, they have a bimetallic currency. The gold does not circulate in the East. The silver does not circulate in the West. So you appear to have a very slow process of wedding together two very disparate sections of the conquered territory. Now I'm leaving out Spain. I'm leaving out Sindh, southern Pakistan, the lower Indus Valley. It's underwater now anyway, so who cares? And I'm only going to talk about the West as being Egypt, Tunisia, Syria, Greater Syria in this meaning, and the East as being Iraq and Iran, getting into Central Asia. These are the two big areas. They do not have a unified economy. They retain the administrative practices of the preceding empires, of the Byzantines and the Sassanids. There's been work done going into quite some detail, particularly on the Iranian side, about this retention of Sassanid Persian practices. Michael Morini at UCLA has written a book on the first century Muslim rule in Iraq. You also have very good work done on Egypt based on early papyri that are in Greek and sometimes bilingual in Greek and Arabic, showing the continuation of Greek ruling practices in Egypt and Syria, well, primarily in Egypt because we don't have the papyri from Syria. Following on what I lectured on last week, there is what appears, I think now to most historians, to be the near certainty that almost everyone living in this empire in those first 70 to 100 years was a non-Muslim. In other words, this Umayyad Caliphate, this Rashidun Caliphate, consisted of an extraordinarily thin veneer of a ruling establishment and its army spread geographically over an enormous territory and ruling over a non-Muslim population that had its own economy, had its own religious practices, had its own administrative traditions, had its own educational and legal institutions. And of course, one of the great questions is when that happens, because it's not the only time in history that you've had a thin veneer of people spread widely. There's a question of why does it sometimes change the society and other times it doesn't? So later on we're going to discover, for example, that the Mongols, who have an enormously powerful and extensive empire that stretches from Iraq to Beijing for 100 years almost. The Mongols leave very little trace. They don't leave, they just don't leave much evidence that they were there once you get past the period when they're actually ruling. If you take, on the other hand, the Germans who come into the late Roman Empire, they transform Europe. And they become the people who define the culture of the early medieval period in Europe, as I'll be talking about next week. Clearly, when you go to the colonial period, we're dealing with tiny numbers of Spaniards and Portuguese and Dutch and English who have, in some cases, powerfully transformative impacts. But there, particularly these days, when we have so much post-colonial theorizing, you can go back to what I've talked about earlier with Hellenization. To what degree did this apparent triumph of Greek culture pervade by a veneer of Greek and Macedonian war veterans and ruling families after Alexander? To what degree was that real? To what degree did that really penetrate the society? Now, the one thing that appears to be unquestioned about the conquest of Islam is that in the long run, everything was changed. It was not an epiphenomenon. Rather than disappearing, the Arabs, who at the time of the conquest were known almost exclusively in the Arabian desert and in the desert fringe areas in Iraq and Syria, the Arabic language becomes adopted all the way from the borders of Iran across to Morocco. So the notion of what an Arab is changes completely, and the Arabs are seen as the purveyors of a new culture, a new religion. In the long run, the great preponderance of the population converts to this religion, and the culture, the society, comes to be defined by the institutional and intellectual and spiritual particulars of this new religion. So what you deal with Islam is spectacular success compared with numerous other historical examples of extraordinary conquest followed by indifferent follow-on effectiveness. So why was Islam so successful? Probably that, you know, some of you will be saying, well, why am I talking about Islam as if it were a, you know, an improvised explosive device or something? And it's, Islam is not a thing. And so when I say, why is Islam successful? Obviously, it's not, Islam is not an agent here. It's simply the collectivity of Muslims. You can say, well, why were Muslims successful? But then the problem is, if you do it that way, then you realize that the Muslims subdivide and subdivide and subdivide into different localized communities that aggregate in different ways, that have somewhat different beliefs, and it becomes harder and harder to define exactly what you mean about Islam. But let me pursue this business. You had a ruling family in Damascus. You had a Shiite movement opposed to it that never manages to come to power, or at least rarely manages to come to power, so can be sort of put on the back burner. You have a split economy, a split tradition of administration and of governing language, and you have a population that is overwhelmingly non-Muslim, split between Christians from the Tigris and Euphrates westward and Zoroastrians from the Tigris and Euphrates eastward, with Jews sprinkled in somewhat a clumpy fashion here and there in both Iran, Iraq, and Syria and Egypt. And these are your main groups. Once you go farther, you get some pagan outliers in Central Asia and North Africa. You get some Buddhist outliers as you move toward India and Afghanistan. But it's primarily Jews, Christians, and Zoroastrians. In 750, there is a change of government. The Umayyad family that has been ruling from Damascus somehow managed to rule from Damascus without actually seeming to leave any imprint on the city at all beyond the main mosque. They're overthrown. They're overthrown by a movement from Iran, particularly from northeastern Iran, that has a very strong, has a leadership element that combines some of the family of Muhammad, particularly from the descendants of his uncle Al-Abbas, were called the Abbasids. Ali was the cousin of Muhammad. His father was known as Abu Talib. Al-Abbas is a brother of Abu Talib. It's a different uncle. So you had members of the family of Abbas who may or may not have thought of themselves as stalking horses for the family of Ali. A lot of debate about that. And you had a certain number of Iranians of somewhat mysterious character. In other words, seemingly the money man behind the revolt that brings the Abbasids to power in 750 appears to be the son of a Buddhist monk from a very powerful monastery in northern Afghanistan. And in the late 700s, the descendants of this particular the abbot of this Buddhist monastery become the most powerful family in the Abbasid Caliphate, other than the caliphs themselves. They're known as the Barmakids. Ultimately, this comes from their ancestor, whose name is given as Barmak, but that is actually from the Sanskrit pramukha, meaning an elder of a Buddhist monastery, and we're pretty sure that this is pinned down, that these were people of a Buddhist background, not Zoroastrian. So you think, how did the Buddhists get control of Islam? That doesn't seem quite right. Other people who were involved in this movement were Iranians who appeared to have had heterodox views of different sorts. Some of them believed in transmigration of souls. Were they Buddhists? We don't know. There was one in particular who was considered the central ringleader of the whole thing, who went by the nom de guerre of Abu Muslim, always portrayed carrying a hatchet. I have no idea why he's portrayed carrying a hatchet, but he is. By the 13th, 14th century, you have a long epic poem. That's the saga of Abu Muslim. There's no saga of the Abbasids, just of Abu Muslim. We don't know really who he is. He may have been from Isfahan, but he may have been from somewhere else. Certainly his name was out, not Abu Muslim, but there's no agreement as to what his real name was. He is portrayed as putting the Abbasids in power and then being executed by the Caliph in order to keep him from exercising the genuine power that he had achieved. So this led historians, particularly at the late 19th century, to say that what happened was that the Iranians took over Islam. There was a very famous German historian named Julius Wellhausen, who wrote a book called The Arab Kingdom and Its Fall. Kingdom, meaning Mulk, meaning the Umayyads. The story of the Umayyads and their fall. The Arab kingdom comes to an end. What comes after it? The Persians take over. This is being written around the time of Bismarck, German unification, the idea of the national folk becoming expressed through a United State. And so you had Iranian people who were very big on Iran, particularly Germans, because they saw them as Aryans, saying this is the Iranian takeover from the effete Arabs, and then other people who are pro-Arab saying, no, this is still an Arab thing. It's surprising how deep some of these feelings go. I argued with my thesis advisor again and again and again that Muslim colleges first arose in the 900s, if not even in the late 800s, in northeastern Iran. And he said, no, 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 no. And we did not have a happy time over this argument, except I had a lot of evidence and he had tenure. So he was sort of edging me out in this. And eventually he wrote an article for the Second Encyclopedia of Islam, the second edition, about these colleges. And he said, the colleges originated in northeastern Iran in the 10th century, citing evidence that had been brought to his attention somehow at an earlier stage, but failing to cite my work. And then he said, some Iranian nationalists say that they're a Persian invention. But even though they arise in Iran, they're purely Arab. He was an Arab from Detroit. And I never realized when I was studying with him that he was an Arab nationalist, despite the fact he looked exactly like Gamal Abdel Nasser. But the sense of what is Arab and what is Persian deeply affects the field to this day. The number of Arabists who learn, Yek Do Se Char in Persian, who can count to 10, is minuscule. The number of scholars of Iran who can read Arabic is pretty substantial because that is the language in which all the early Iranian sources about Iranian history are written. So if you're going to write the early history of Iran, you have to know Arabic. But if you're going to write history of Islam from an Arab point of view, you don't have to know anything about Iran. And then you have slanging matches. You know, the Persians say the Arabs are lizard eaters. All right, what's wrong with lizard? You know, South American prairie chicken, that's another. And then I knew chameleon being marketed, iguana being marketed under that label. And then the Arabs respond that the Persians are effete and of course Shiites, and as Shiites they believe in temporary marriage because they're sex mad. It's terrible stuff. But it affects the scholarship. And one of the effects is that the scholarship focuses on Syria and Arabia. That is the story of early Islam. The story of the Rashidun Caliphs, the story of the Umayyads, and to the degree that it deals with places to the east, it deals with Iraq, and particularly with the two big garrisons that become major cities in Iraq, Kufa and Basra, and then at the beginning of the Abbasid period, the city of Baghdad. These are the, you say, well, the real centers of Islam are Kufa and Basra and Baghdad in Iraq, and then Damascus, particularly Damascus in Syria, Cairo, or what was then called Fustat in Egypt, and Mecca and Medina. And this is where the culture of early Islam develops. But if you're an Iranian, or if you are looking at this from an Iranian point of view, what you say is Iran was the center of the Caliphate from the time of the fall of the Umayyads in 750 down until, let's say, for 250 years, the real center of Islam was in Iran. And not in Iraq, not in the sort of pseudo-Iran where the Sassanids and the Parthians and the Achaemenids had their administrative headquarters, but rather up on the Iranian plateau. You climb the mountains, up on the Zagros Mountains that separate Iraq from Iran, and you go onto the plateau, and the plateau becomes the center of the Islamic community. How do we know that? Why should one suggest such a thing other than being some sort of corrupt Iranian nationalist, which I'm not. I'm kind of sort of a Northern Illinois nationalist, but we don't have a dog in this fight, so what can I say? One thing you can do is to look at where the geographical origin is of the people who become prominent interpreters of Islam. The scholars, the collectors of the hadith of the Prophet, the originators of legal and philosophical, theological views. Where are these people born? The philosophers. Where do they come from? Well, they sure as hell don't come from Egypt, and they don't come from Syria. If you do a hard count on the basis of pretty extensive quantifiable material, you'll find that Egypt and Syria together, prior to the year 1200, never produce more than 20% of the religious elite of Islam as that elite comes to be to leave traces in the documentary record. It's usually something like 12, 13% for Syria and 4 or 5% for Egypt. It is astonishing how insignificant Egypt is when you consider that people today think Cairo must have been the great center of Islam, it wasn't. Baghdad was a great center, but not Cairo. And the Egyptians were not playing much of a role in Islam. The Syrians slightly more. But let us say from 850 until 1150 or so, Iran is producing between, say, 35 and 50% of all of the religious elite of the Muslim community. Incidentally, Spain is producing, like 0.01%. Southern Pakistan, same thing. I mean, the game is all in these two areas, Iraq and Iran, which together are way over 50%, with Iran becoming more important than Iraq. And Egypt and Syria trailing far behind. That then changes. By 1250, most of the religious elite of the Muslim world are either Egyptians or Iranians, or Egyptians or Syrians. You have a tremendous change in the locus, the center of gravity of Islamic culture and religious thought and writing. That takes place pretty much in the 13th century. But before that, it's really Iran. And the question is, why Iran? They don't speak Arabic. They all learn Arabic if they're scholars. They have to, because the language of Islam was Arabic. The Persian language does not really take shape in Arabic script until the 900s, and even more the 1000s. And there remains to this day a great deal of debate over where in the world, but first about why Iran does not learn to speak Arabic as the basic language of the country, because Middle Persian was no more alien to the Arabic language than the Egyptian spoken in Byzantine times, and yet Egypt becomes completely Arabic speaking and Iran does not. So there's a question of why Iran becomes Arabic speaking, and then there's a question of the nature of the new language. The nature of the new language has two hallmarks. First, it is exceedingly simple. We know of 8 to 10 Middle Persian languages and dialects that were spoken in Iran at the time of the conquest. And gradually they all disappear or survive only as obscure remnants in far distant valleys in Tajikistan and things like that, Yalkanobi, for example. But by and large, all of these Middle Persian languages disappear, and they're replaced by a single language that is simpler than any of them. It has no case endings, has no gender, it has a verb structure that is phenomenally simple. It has a vocabulary that is simplified in various ways. So that's one characteristic. The second characteristic of this new language, which is we have no pre-Islamic manifestation of this form of Persian. But the other hallmark of it is that it's written in the Arabic script. I think about that. You have a new language that is understood by every Iranian from Baghdad to Kabul, no matter what their own language is. They all more or less can understand this new language because it is kind of a simple distillation. But the only way they can understand it when it's written is if they're Muslims, because they have to know the Arabic script. Now, my conclusion, even though the earliest evidence for this comes from chance preservation of lines of poetry. My own belief is that this was a trade language. And the reason there was one language was because for the first time in history, you started to have a high volume of inter-regional and intra-regional trade involving Iranians. And that it specifically involved Muslim Iranians. So that putting it in the Arabic language at a time when almost everyone was a non-Muslim was a way of keeping it secret. In the same way that Jews, at many points in history, put their records and their correspondence in Hebrew characters, even if the language itself is German or Arabic or Persian or something. They'll use Hebrew characters. Armenians done the same thing because the alphabet is a form of code. It's a way of concealing the meaning, because at a period when you don't have broad literacy, you can't get Rosetta Stone for Persian. I mean, you don't have an easy way to learn it. There are no grammar books, there are no dictionaries. And for the Arabic script, you really have to be a Muslim to know it. So you have a trade language that's understandable everywhere in the Iranian region, from Baghdad to Central Asia, Baghdad to Afghanistan. And it's specific to Muslims. Now, it also shows up among the Jews, so that some of the earliest manifestations of this new language are in Judeo-Persian, suggesting that if there is a change in the commercial universe, it was shared by the Jews, but it was dominated by the Muslims. So when I wrote about this, that was a final conclusion I got to. My God, the language shows that there was a commercial change. Now I'm taking the opposite course. I'm saying, let us start from the idea that language shows that there was a burgeoning of commerce and of interregional travel that brought merchants into contact with each other differentially as Muslims. In other words, the Muslim merchants had great contact with one another and used the new language, whereas the Zoroastrian merchants or the Zoroastrian farmers or landholders, they stayed home. They weren't part of whatever was going on. So now you're looking at the possibility that Iran is becoming prominent not because of anything special about its Islam, so much as something that's happening in its economy. It's almost a truism that Islamic history avoids ever talking about the economy, because it's long we felt we simply had no sources. But now you have the possibility that maybe the reason Iran and Iraq become important in these, say, from 750 down to 1000 or 1050, is because of something that's happening in the economy that is tied to Islam. And it's something that's not happening in Egypt and Syria. So what could be happening in one area that's not happening in another area that could be tied to Islam? It's also worth noting that under the previous Persian empires, I've mentioned this again and again, the center of rule and administration, and to a large degree of commerce for the Sassanids, the Parthians, and the Achaemenids was in Iraq. And it was tied into the old tradition of Mesopotamian trade. But now you appear to have this trade taking place on the Iranian plateau. Now, at the time of the Arab conquest, it seems likely from the scattered bits of information we have that there probably were no cities larger than 5,000 to 8,000 people anywhere on the, in what we now call Iran. Maybe in the southwest, but elsewhere the cities were sort of walled garrisons where villagers could take refuge if there was raiding, and where caravans could stop when they were carrying goods to and from China on the Silk Road. But you didn't have any metropolis. There's very little evidence that you had a bazaar. Very little evidence that you had substantial trade, except the trade that goes across the Silk Road, the long distance trade. Because the fact of the matter was that Iran didn't produce anything worth selling, worth buying. It was an agricultural land. It had metal deposits. There were metallic things. There were a few items here and there. But there was no big product, and perhaps more importantly, there was no possibility of travel by water. So whatever trade there was had to be overland because there were no rivers, and overland trade is vastly more expensive than waterborne trade. So what happened to the economy? What I believe happened, and what I've written about, is that Iran experienced the same sort of thing that the United States experienced in the 18th century, that Egypt experienced in the 19th century, that experienced a massive cotton boom. And that what transformed the economy of Iran was the growth of cotton. Egypt we think of in later times as being a huge producer of cotton. But there was no cotton grown in ancient Egypt. Ancient Egypt was a land of linen, and all the mummies were wrapped in linen, not in cotton. Cotton is a late comer to Egypt. There was some cotton grown in the Orontes River Valley in Syria, but not very much. The European words for cotton come in from Syria. There was no cotton grown in Europe, of course. But cotton was not that common. The only part of the Arab world that grew cotton in any quantity was Yemen. Now it happens that many of the Arabs who were shipped off to fight wars in Iran were from Yemen. So now you have a group of Arabs. They go off to fight wars, but the wars come to an end. They have to fit into the economy. They're saying, gee, we're in a country that has a really hot summer, a long growing season, and we know how to grow cotton, which they've never heard of. We have almost no evidence that cotton was even known in Iran as other than an import in the pre-Islamic period. We know that in Central Asia there was cotton grown, but that cotton was grown in river valleys that you didn't have in Iran, so you couldn't easily transfer the economy. Plus, the words used for cotton in Central Asia were all derived from Sanskrit, or the principal ones were derived from Sanskrit, showing that the connections were with India, where cotton is a long time major production item, and not with Iran. The words used for cotton elsewhere in Iran were not the Sanskrit words from Central Asia. So, what happened? What I believe happened is that Arabs and small numbers of converts to Islam were faced with the issue of how do we live here in Iran after the war. This is a country where the land is owned and settled by the people who were there when we conquered. Nothing in early Islamic law or tradition indicates that the Arabs were permitted to settle on the land. They could not simply displace the previous owners, say in the way the English could displace the Indians in this country. So here you had these Arabs. They had money because they'd been part of the army. They shared in the booty. They were on the payroll for the army. But they didn't have any land in a country that was overwhelmingly agricultural, had almost no manufacturers, and what were they going to do? Islamic law states that if you bring dead land under production, you own the land. Now, I've talked about this issue of ownership before. What does ownership really mean? We've always defined ownership in Western Civ as ownership of land, but you also have ownership of animals, and you have ownership of water. In Iran, the crucial thing appears to be ownership of water. Iran has no shortage of land. It's a huge country, except it's mostly a desert. If you can bring water to the desert, you fulfill the condition of bringing dead land under production, and you now own the land. But of course, you own the water first. But ownership of the water is very particular in Iran because it does not follow either the Egyptian practice of using the flood on the Nile, where you have collective cultivation of the lands that are flooded by the Nile, nor does it follow the Mesopotamian practice of diverting river water from the Tigris and Euphrates into canals, and then diverting water from the canals onto the fields, where you have to have a collective administration of the canals and constant and repeated upkeep of the canals. But rather, Iran's water is either winter snow and rain, which will support crops in certain areas. The crops usually taking the form of wheat and barley that are planted in November and come up in March, winter wheat, in other words, winter barley. But there are no rivers. In the spring, the runoff will produce torrents, the sort you can find in San Diego or Los Angeles occasionally. The torrents are useless, essentially, because it's just lasts for a week or so, then the river goes back down again. But what Iran does have, because of winter rains and snows, is groundwater. Now, they have an old practice of groundwater. So here you have the mountainside, and you have a layer of wet soil. If you dig into this soil here with a well, and you get down, this is impervious rock down here, so the water doesn't go any farther, seep in any farther. And essentially, your water is flowing downhill. It'll end up in the center of the country in some salt marsh or salt pan, the sort you have in in Death Valley. But if you dig down here, your well will fill with water. Well, that'll be called a mother well. So then you say, well, I want to have a village here, so I would like to have water flow out of the ground here, where it can irrigate crops, provide fresh water for the village, and then irrigate more crops downstream from the village. So if I could have an underground tunnel, I would run like this. The water would flow out by gravity flow. And this tunnel is called a qanat. The technology was known in Iran. There were engineers who were specialists on how to design these tunnels, extremely demanding both to design and to dig, because you have to dig a series of wells and then connect them underground in order to have light and oxygen for the diggers. And you have to start here. Because if you started here, you'd all drown. So you're digging back upstream, planning to hit the water table up here someplace. I think that the qanats that they had before Islam primarily were auxiliary sources of water for communities that had their basic water from rivers or rainfall or springs or something like that. What you get with Islam is a huge boom in new villages watered exclusively by qanats. This can be substantiated in a perhaps unconvincing way by a careful quantitative study of place names that I will not go into, because it's a sort of, strange methodology that has not gained universal approbation. Besides which, I've all written about it in my book on cotton climate and camels in early Islamic Iran. Once you have the water flowing, it's flowing by gravity. You don't have to lift it. This isn't a well. This doesn't require a shaduf or a saqiyya or any of these irrigating devices. You simply have a little stream. It's like an artificial spring that flows out in the ground, and you can use it to grow crops in the middle of the desert. You cannot have a village before you have the water, because it's in the middle of the desert. You can't have the tunnel unless you have the money to pay for the tunnel. You can't have the tunnel or the village unless you have people who will do the digging and who will plant the crops. So in other words, there is a very substantial level of entrepreneurship. Somebody has to put up the money. Someone has to designate the place. Someone has to recruit the labor. Someone has to pay all these expenses up front. This is a capital-intensive project. Well, who better than these Muslims who have their money from the army? Because this is the way they can become part of the agricultural economy. Now, the problem is that this is so expensive that you're not going to grow wheat and barley on this land. But then the wheat and barley is being planted in November and coming up in March and being harvested before the heat of the summer. And for cotton, you want to take advantage of the heat of the summer. So what you're doing is that you're using the 12-month-a-year flow of the water to supply the other requirement for cotton growing. In other words, a long, hot growing season plus abundant water. So you grow cotton. The people who grew the cotton were Muslims. Many of them were in sort of the pioneering early stages of Islam, at least in Iran, either as Arab immigrants or as converts. They were also the primary sources of knowledge about Islam. So if you wanted to find out about Islam, you went to, these guys, and you said, tell me about your religion. Or maybe you went and you said, I'd like a job, on your next village. And they said, hey, fine, love to have you. By the way, you have to be a Muslim, because we don't want no pagans here on our precious land. Well, it turns out that there are many hadith of the Prophet that say that Muslim men are not permitted to wear silk. Specifically, they are not permitted to wear embroidered silk or brocade. Dibaj is the word in Arabic. You can't wear dibaj. And specific hadith will say, silk is for them in this world and for us in the next world. Because the Quran actually says that in paradise you wear silk. Because silk is really, really nice. I mean, it feels good to wear. But it was one of the joys of paradise. It wasn't for this world, for the believers. And so you have hadith that will say, you know, the prophet was given a piece of silk or a silk garment. So he gave it to Abu Bakr. And then Abu Bakr said, why are you giving me this garment when you won't wear it yourself? He said, well, I thought maybe you'd give it to someone else. I mean, they knew the value of silk. They knew how nice silk was, but they wouldn't wear it, according to these stories. These stories are all being collected in Iran. And they're saying men can't wear silk. What can they wear? Well, they should wear what the prophet wore. They should wear plain white. The prophet liked plain white. Not brocade, not figured stuff. The Sassanid elite wore, you know, amazingly complex figured brocades of silk. Now you had the Muslim elite are wearing plain white cotton, sometimes plain black, sometimes striped, but not beyond stripes, not much of anything. If you want to have a luxury fabric for the Muslims, in other words, if the ruler, if the Caliph wants to produce a luxury fabric, it's plain white cotton with 2 inches of silk embroidery. And so you have hadith that say, God has prohibited the Muslims from wearing silk, except the width of 2 inches. You know, it's kind of transparent that the same guys who were growing the cotton were the pioneers of Islam and were telling people that if you're going to become a Muslim, you have to wear what we are producing. So as the conversion curve proceeds, the market for their goods grows. It's better than that because Iraq can't grow cotton. Iraq has 2 tumultuous rivers that are so destructive in the spring when they carry the snow melt down from Turkey, the Tigris and Euphrates, that you don't do summer cropping in Iraq. In the first place, it's just beastly hot. Secondly, the rivers destroy the irrigation works, and so you spend the summer trying to put them back together, and then you really grow fall crops. So there was almost no cotton grown in Iraq. There were a couple of canals where cotton could be grown. So instead, Iraq imported all of its cotton from Iran. Baghdad became the Manchester of the Iranian cotton farmers, just as Manchester was the Manchester of the southern plantation owners. So you apparently had immense quantities of cotton being grown in Iran and sold to Muslims. But of course, they had to be manufactured. Now, did you carry the raw cotton to Baghdad and have it manufactured there? No, you probably did not. You probably did the manufacturing in Iran and carried the finished cloth around. Now, that means that you have to have manufactories. We know almost nothing about it. But this becomes the great accelerator of urban development in Iran. That now you have an industrial product on a very large scale that is being developed in Muslim population centers in Iran. By, let's say, the year 850 or 900, it appears that among the religious scholarly elite in Iran, 40% of the people who were specialists on Islam were either grew cotton or sold cotton cloth. It was the trade. And there was nothing comparable to it in Iraq, but it had certain things. It meant that you had Muslim Iranians traveling. They were traveling to sell cloth, but they were also traveling to collect hadith. Most of the hadith of the Prophet are collected by Iranians in Iran and Iraq. not in Spain, not in Yemen, but in Iraq and Iran. These merchants need to have communications. This is where I think the new Persian language comes from. It is the language that they pioneer as a as a byproduct of the growth of a manufacturing sector devoted to cotton cloth. The result is a massive, one of the world's great periods of urbanization. Between, let us say, 650, 651, when the last Sassanid Shah is killed, and the year 1000, 350 years, the largest cities of Iran grow from the, let us say, 5 to 10,000 person range to the 100 to 200,000 person range. There's a massive urbanization for a pre-modern economy. Plus, it differs from almost every comparable period of urbanization you can think of, in that it's not accompanied by a gross increase in population. In other words, you have a differential distribution of population. People are moving from the countryside into these manufacturing cities. And in the process, they are engaging in cotton growing, I think particularly near the cities. And this has two consequences. One is that it removes labor from the countryside so that the remaining number of farmers declines, and it removes acreage from growing grain. So as the cities grow, Iran becomes hyper-urbanized. So that by the year 1000, Iran has the largest cities in the world not on navigable water. It has a level of urbanization that would be comparable perhaps to Renaissance Italy or Flanders at the height of its cotton trade or of its wool trade. But instead of having navigable water, all the trade is overland. Now this is important because if you look at the history of Italian cities during the Renaissance, and for that matter Flanders, so I know less about that, one of the things you find is that they had to import food. They did not grow enough food to support these hyper-urbanized populations. And some people have argued that the Black Death of 1348 is exacerbated by malnutrition in the Italian countryside because there simply weren't enough farmers left to support the people in the cities. So one of the things that you'll find in Iran, it seems, is that when you get a crisis, Iran isn't producing enough food to support its cities. So after the year 1000, when the crisis begins, you start to get famines, you start to get epidemic disease, and you start to get urban unrest with violence between factions. And by the year 1100, after a century of this, you're getting large-scale emigration of Iranians leaving Iran. And this emigration is really important because despite the fact that Iranian ruling dynasties had played a major role in world history under the Achaemenids or the Parthians and the Sassanids and so forth, these great empires, none of them had ever exported their language. Now, for the first time, Persian becomes a cultural language outside of Iran. It spreads to Turkey, it spreads to Central Asia, it spreads to India. It doesn't spread because the Turks and the Indians and the Central Asians, as some scholars have maintained, decided they thought Persian was a prettier language than their own. I can't believe anyone ever wrote something like that. But rather because there were so many Iranians around who were educated, literate, good writers, and they had an audience of other Iranians because they had emigrated from a country that was falling into an economic catastrophe. Out of that economic catastrophe, Syria and Egypt rise to become the center of the Islamic world. And this is the second rise of the Arabs. So if you talk about the Umayyads as the Arab kingdoms and its fall, this is the resurrection of the Arabs. That comes not because of anything the Arabs did, because in fact the people who are ruling during this resurrection are not Arabs, they're Turkish slave soldiers, as I'll talk about next time, but rather because Iran collapses and Iraq collapses. And it's such an exciting story that I can hardly wait until Thursday to continue to tell you about it.